Hi, and thanks very much for joining me. What we're going to look at today is liberalising legislation during the time of Harold Wilson's government. And legislation is the law or a set of laws that have been passed by Parliament. It's a word to describe the making of an act of Parliament, and it's important that you understand that. It's also important that you understand the basic structure of Parliament and how a government works. And within Parliament, when you have a party that's in power, in this case the Labour Party during the 1960s, you have the government. They are the ministers, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, who are responsible for the running of the country. But you've also got other members of the Labour Party, other Labour MPs, who are known as backbenchers, and they sit quite literally towards the rear of the chamber along the backbenches, but they've still got an ability. They can still raise issues, they can still debate topics. And during this period of the 1960s, a number of backbench MPs managed to get through some significant changes in legislation, liberalising changes in legislation, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And then at the end, I'm going to ask the question, is it the Labour Party that's responsible for liberalising change, or is it these backbenches MPs that are responsible for the change, and therefore not Harold Wilson and not the government? Now, for a backbench MP to be able to pass or be able to propose a piece of legislation and for it to become successful, it's known as a private member's bill. Therefore, all of these backbench MPs are going to be conducting their work by virtue of private members' bills, and it's worth us understanding what one of those is. Private members' bills are public bills introduced by MPs and lords who are not government ministers. As with other public bills, their purpose is to change the law as it applies to the general population. A minority of private members' bills become law. By creating publicity around an issue, they may affect legislation indirectly. So in that definition, which comes from the Parliament's own website, they're recognising that it's a minority of private members' bills that generally make it through to become law. However, a significant number are going to get through during this period. And we need to understand why that is. Harold Wilson, who's become Prime Minister, is conservative, and by that I mean small c conservative. He's traditional in his views on life. Whereas the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, is very liberal in his views. He's very forward thinking. And one of the things you need to consider when understanding this issue, when understanding this broader issue, is the effect of Roy Jenkins as Home Secretary during this period. Is he a key factor in allowing this legislation through? So what we're going to look at 5 key pieces of legislation. We're going to look at the end of capital punishment. We're going to look at divorce reform. We're going to look at the legalisation of abortion. We're going to look at the legalisation of homosexual relationships. And then we're going to look at theatre censorship. And we're going to look at those individually, each one. A very quick view of each one as well. It is always worth doing that wider reading and digging deeper into each topic. This is just a recap to cover each of these. And we'll start with the abolition of the death penalty. And we have to go back to 1955 and a woman called Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis is executed. She's hanged for the murder of her partner. She shoots him. And it causes a lot of outcry at the time. The Daily Mirror runs a campaign against her execution, and there are a number of issues surrounding it. If that had taken place today, there is no way she'd have been executed. It is very unlikely she'd have been found guilty. She was in an abusive relationship. However, the execution of Ruth Ellis really brings the death penalty back into the public eye, really causes it to be a topic of debate amongst the general public, amongst media, and amongst politicians. And as a result of that, Sidney Silverman really begins a campaign to see the abolition of the death penalty. He is a backbench Labour MP, and he's now campaigning for the abolition of the death penalty. In 1965, a free vote is held, and by the free vote, that means government whips are not going to put pressure on members of Parliament to vote in a certain direction. Generally, in votes in Parliament, government whips will say to the MPs of their party, you are expected to vote in this direction to support the party. There's a 1-line whip, 2-line whip, and a 3-line whip. However, for the abolition of the death penalty, it is decided it will be a free vote. Members of Parliament will be able to vote based on their own conscience. And in 1965, the death penalty is abolished for a trial period of 5 years. However, in 1969, that abolition is made permanent. Now, it's worth noting at this point that public opinion is actually against this. It varies between 60% and 80% of voters who say, we want the death penalty. It generally changes depending on there being a crime, depending on the media at the time. But always more than 50% of the population want the death penalty to remain. And therefore it's worth looking at why does Parliament abolish the death penalty? And there's a useful quote, again going back to Sandbrook on this issue. And he says it fits in well with the popular image of the mid-60s as a period in which the Labour government, inspired by a new climate of liberalism and cultural freedom, ran ahead of public opinion by passing legislation to create a permissive society. The historian Christy Davey, for example, suggests that this reflected a wider enthusiasm for technical rationality and social engineering. In other words, a general confidence of the power of experts to bring about social change. And it's really worth looking at that quote, and again I keep saying this, using other historians in your work to back up your argument. Because there's that difference between knowledge, knowing facts, and understanding, when you can put these facts together to form a constructive argument, and using other historians helps you do that. Sandbrook also uses a phrase in here, by passing legislation to create a permissive society. Later on we'll look at another video where we look at that phrase, what the idea of permissive society is. However, we're going to move on, we're going to look at another aspect now, and we're going to look at the Divorce Reform Act of 1969. And prior to the 1960s, divorce law required that one party had committed adultery in order to allow a divorce. So it means that for many divorces, it's an expensive process. You've got to hire a private investigator to prove that the other partner is seeing someone else. And that can result in it being too expensive for many people to do that. And it's also a very, very painful experience. Now, the Labour MP, Leo Abse, he campaigns for changes to divorce legislation which allow for a no-fault divorce to take place. And this changes divorce law. It now means that after 2 years, if both parties consent, they can divorce, or after 5 years, if only one party consents, they can divorce. But this is going to make divorce more accessible to people. It's going to make it easier for people to divorce. There are a number of things that fall out of this though as a result. There's a clear increase in the number of divorces. And we've got some detail here that we can look at. So in 1950, there had been 2 divorces for every 1,000 marriages. But by the 1970s, there are 10 divorces for every 1,000 marriages. And it's clearly, an argument can be made here that divorce is easy to obtain as well because of this growing female liberalism. And we've looked at that in a previous video where women are being able to find their own voice, women are being able to have that power to take control of their own lives to a greater degree. And divorce is an aspect of that. There are counter-arguments. People didn't like the idea of divorce legislation changing. Some people said that it meant that marriage had now become a trial period, and after 2 years, if you didn't like it, you could just give up and walk away. However, divorce legislation changes in 1969, and we can see the effects of that there. So we're going to move on now, and we're going to look at another piece of legislation, and we're going to look at the legalisation of abortion. Now, up to 1967, abortion had been illegal in the United Kingdom unless it was on very clear, strict and specific medical grounds. Essentially, the mother's life was at danger. However, this meant that a large number of women were taking what were known as backstreet abortions, illegal abortions, often conducted by unqualified people in dangerous premises, not in hospitals, not in safe places for this to be conducted. But you saw between 100,000 and 200,000 abortions being carried out in this way each year. And there was a consequence of that. It meant that there were 35,000 women being admitted to hospital with serious complications because of these backstreet abortions. And you can see here, between 1958 and 1960, 82 women died as a result of backstreet abortions. These deaths were also taking place at the same time as what is known as the thalidomide disaster. In the 1950s and 1960s, a drug called thalidomide was used with women who were suffering extreme morning sickness, and it was to deal with the symptoms of morning sickness. However, as a result of this, a growing number of children were being born without the long bones of their arms and legs. They were born with disabilities. And the reaction to this was a support for abortion legislation. The morality of that I'm not going into. However, these are the facts. That the thalidomide disaster, as it was called, resulted in a growing argument for abortion. And as a result, the Liberal MP, so a different party to Labour, the Liberal MP, David Steele, pushes for reforms to abortion legislation, and he's supported by the government and a number of Conservative MPs. As a result of this, the Abortion Act 1967 permits the legal termination of pregnancy within the first 28 weeks under medical supervision and with the written consent of 2 doctors. In addition, it recognises that mental suffering of a pregnant woman is justification for abortion, that mental suffering has equal standing as physical suffering. Now, a consequence, a result of this change in legislation is that the number of abortions increases from 4 in 100 births in 1968 to 17.6 per 100 by 1975. But you've got to accept that the backstreet abortions were never counted in that 1968 figure. So we only know that 4 in 100 legal abortions took place. We don't know how many backstreet abortions took place as well. The next thing I want to move on to now is the legalisation of homosexuality, or the decriminalisation of homosexuality. And again, we're going to be looking at the work of the Labour MP Leo Abse on this one. Now, the Wolfenden Commission in the 1950s, in the late 1950s, had recommended that homosexuality be decriminalised, and that had been dismissed by the government of the time. It's worth recognising, it's worth knowing that Harold Wilson also dismissed this recommendation as well. It wasn't just the Conservative Party. Wilson, as leader of the Labour Party, also said this commission was wrong and homosexuality should not be decriminalised. However, our Labour MP, Leo Abse, he campaigns for a reform of legislation, and we see the 1967 Sexual Offences Act decriminalises homosexuality if the following conditions are met. First of all, both partners had to be over the age of 21. That means the age of consent for homosexual relationships is above the age of consent for heterosexual relationships. So by no means are we seeing equality here, we're just seeing a change in legislation. Both partners had to consent, clearly that's the case, and it had to be in private. Now this meant no one else had to be in the same building. So hotels, anything like that, you couldn't have a homosexual relationship. But it also meant that if you were walking down the street holding hands with someone else, that was classed as a homosexual relationship. You couldn't have any public expression of a relationship. All you could do is have private expression of a relationship. But it's a move forwards. It's a significant move forwards due to the work of Leo Abse, who's a Labour backbench MP. What we see as a result, though, is that homosexual men have to live what are described as double lives to avoid prosecution. As I've explained, you couldn't have any expression of a relationship in public. We still see many homosexual men being prosecuted for having a relationship in public, and prejudice against homosexuality continues. And again, I accept that there are strong arguments to say prejudice continues today in many parts or in some parts of society. We're only looking at 1960s here, and prejudice against homosexual men is still very prevalent during that period. But it's a move forward. This is a piece of liberalising legislation thanks to Leo Abse. What I now want to move on to is another piece of legislation, and we're going to look at the Theatres Act of 1968 and how the power of the Lord Chamberlain is removed. And the Lord Chamberlain essentially had to grant licences for plays to be performed. So you would write a play, you would be ready to perform it, you would then go to Lord Chamberlain's office and ask for a licence to perform that. And it essentially meant that the Lord Chamberlain's office had a power of censorship over you. If you did perform a play without a licence, you could be prosecuted. Now, there were ways that some theatres got around this, some plays got around this. They would sell tickets to a dress rehearsal and things like that. It still did result in some prosecutions. However, George Strauss, a Labour backbench MP, he campaigns for a change in the law which would remove the theatrical censorship. And the 1968 Theatres Act comes into force and it removes the power of the Lord Chamberlain's office. It now means that office can no longer dictate what can and cannot be performed in theatres. That has a follow-on effect. You start to see that liberalisation creep across to television, start to creep across to cinema. But all of that comes from George Strauss's move with the theatre censorship piece. So, we then go back to that question. How much credit could the Labour government actually take for liberalising legislation during the 1960s? And I've put a nice simple 2-column table up there for us to have a quick look at. And first of all, I'm saying yes, the government could take credit here. Harold Wilson doesn't obstruct any of these legal reforms. He's a Prime Minister. He could have come out, he could have made a public statement, he could have instructed his MPs not to vote in favour of those, but at no point does he obstruct them. So we could say, great, thumbs up, Harold Wilson should take some credit for that. Roy Jenkins ensures that parliamentary time is given to these backbench MPs in order to help them get their legislation through. There are times when he ensures Parliament runs on through the night so that these acts can be debated. And Labour MPs are given a free vote, linking back to that point I mentioned about Harold Wilson. So the government certainly haven't obstructed this legislation going through. But let's look at the counter-argument now to say that Harold Wilson's Labour government cannot take any credit for this legislation. And first of all, I go back to that point that Wilson didn't support the Wolfenden Committee's recommendation back in the late 1950s, and therefore Wilson should not seek to take any credit now for the liberalising legislation. No prominent Labour cabinet ministers publicly supported this legislation, these changes, apart from Roy Jenkins as Home Secretary, who clearly was supporting it by giving the legislation this time. And many Labour MPs were concerned about how this legislation would be perceived by working class voters. How would they accept the abolition of the death penalty? How would they accept the criminalisation of homosexuality? So by no means was the Labour Party completely on side here. And that's a decision you need to make. When you're writing an essay on this topic, you need to make sure you understand the issues, and then you need to form a balanced and informed judgment. So there we go. Liberalisation, 1960s. Thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.